tracked, which I think has tracked basically what's happening in this space, both at the international and the national level. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ESMC, but I will start with a bit of a historical perspective about how I came to be working where I am, which is really in regenerative agriculture. So in thinking about this, I put some slides together about like milestones and trajectory of ecosystem services and agriculture and regenerative ag, and how did we get here? And I'm taking it all back to the 1990s when I actually started working on this issue. And as Julia pointed out, I was working in the Senate in the 90s on ag and natural resource issues. My boss, Senator Bob Kerrey from Nebraska, came from an agricultural state. And so my job in natural resources and environment was working on agriculture largely. One of the things that I worked on when I was there, like I worked on endangered species and Farm Bill and other things, but one of the things that happened that was really interesting was we were negotiating the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was a treaty we adopted in the United States in 1992, I guess. But at that time, the Kyoto Protocol, which if you haven't heard of, highly controversial protocol, global protocol for how to deal with climate change. My role in it though, however, and my boss's role, we were there to talk about the role of agriculture in climate change. At this time in the Senate, they were discussing all of the impacts of climate change on other sectors, but not agriculture. So my boss and I, our voice was agriculture, agriculture, agriculture. It's a business outdoors, done outdoors, right? Anything that happens environmentally that may impact agriculture, we need to be talking about. So we were talking about agriculture. And at that time, we were talking about soil carbon and how improving soil carbon, which is now the focus of agricultural systems, was a beneficial thing. And we were trying to get credit at that time for the agricultural sector, literally trading carbon credits so that the United States could take credit for that in these negotiations. I put on the slide here, sink's good, right? So literally our position as the members of the Senate who were participating in the negotiations, and we got the US administration, this was Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, to advocate for sinks, soil carbon sinks, forestry sinks, in other words, removals of greenhouse gases from agriculture and forestry as a good proposition. So that was happening. And I continued to work on that for several years and eventually started working on it in the White House, like doing the same thing, advocating for agricultural perspective in these climate change negotiations. In 1999, an interesting thing happened. And I was working at the White House then. Our entire proposition at the White House was the United States wants to get credit for the carbon we store in our soils in agriculture and for the carbon we store in forestry. We went through 2 weeks of negotiations. We got everything we asked for. But after we actually signed a deal, the German Minister of Environment heard from some of their environmental NGOs that they did not necessarily like the deal we had agreed to. What happened then was, even after we had concluded the negotiations, the German minister came back into the room and said, because of that deal on sinks for agriculture and forestry, we withdraw our support. And literally the whole negotiation fell apart. I say sinks bad. What happened after that is for almost 20 years, within the Framework Convention on Climate Change and within the international negotiations, and that's what happened domestically with US environmental policy, is we were not focusing on soil carbon sinks or regenerative ag practices from that perspective of something that could help us and be beneficial. So I say all that as background for how, like, not only my work started. I never stopped working in this arena, but there was a lot that happened at that time that has implications for what we're doing now and why there's suddenly a huge desire to spend so much money on regenerative ag systems with a focus on soil carbon, soil organic matter, improved tilth, health and fertility of soils, and regenerative agricultural systems. In the 2000s, when I was working at the White House, I indicated already, it became like almost an international moratorium on discussing sinks. There was one change to that, and that is that the Italian government, it was actually the EU, did start investing a lot of money in looking at soils as a beneficial, and soil health as something that is potentially beneficial. They were looking at it from the perspective of soil carbon. And that started in the 2000s. It was the International Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy. They started spending much more money on that than anyone has to date, until, and I'll tell you when something changed on that, until, you know, fast forward to 2015, then others started looking at it. But I say all that because for a long time, even though we should have been focusing on agriculture and regenerative ag and all of these beneficial outcomes from agriculture, at the international scale and the domestic scale, we didn't have a real driver to do that. The Framework Convention almost created a driver for us to do that. It went away. In the 2000s, the only thing where there was any of this debate happening in the United States was in California, because they have a cap and trade program. They didn't start thinking about the role of agriculture in that cap and trade program till the mid 2000s. And so that entire cap and trade program was largely built without thinking about agriculture and the role of agriculture, either the impact on ag or the beneficial outcomes from ag. Then in about, I think 2010, they actually did start realizing it and focusing on the role of ag and regenerative ag. They created a healthy soils program, a healthy soils initiative. So they've been a little bit ahead of the curve in California, probably not surprising. Third largest agricultural economy in the world is the California agriculture economy, right? So not entirely surprising. But that for that period of the 2000s, that was really the only place regenerative ag as a system, any funding was going into that, largely in California. I put on here a milestone 2006. Jason Clay, who's with the World Wildlife Fund, did a TED Talk, and I urge people to watch this if you're interested in agriculture and biodiversity and issues like that. His TED Talk was focused on where in the world do we have problems with biodiversity and how do we address that, right? He's with the World Wildlife Fund, that's what they do. And in that TED Talk, he said, agriculture is a problem. Agriculture is destroying biodiversity all around the world, right? And agriculture became this, had this target on its back for a long time, right? Ag is bad. Agriculture is creating negative impacts on biodiversity. I'm not like debating anything Jason said, but I think the implications of that were that suddenly people were like, agriculture, not just in the United States, but around the world, has negative impacts. And we started to lose that positive focus that we did start talking about previously. I won't talk about that again, but it does come up again. And I just urge you to look at that, because a lot of what is happening right now with corporations in the food and beverage sector that is causing them to invest in sustainable ag and regenerative ag comes back to Jason Clay's TED Talk in one way or another, interestingly enough. In terms of other milestones and trajectories, what's happening, from 2009 in the House of Representatives, they actually negotiated a climate change bill that was the first really comprehensive climate change bill ever to pass through either house of Congress. It got nowhere in the Senate. And the reason it got nowhere in the Senate is a problem in the House. In the House, they passed that bill and they dealt with every major sector in the country, transportation, energy, buildings, except agriculture. They cut deals with every sector in the country for that bill except agriculture. And when it came to the floor, they literally had to bend arms to get the agricultural sector and the chairman of the Ag Committee to agree to it, even though they did not want to. That is the reason it failed in the Senate, because immediately the ag sector went to the Senate and said, we want no part of this, right? We became the bad guys in the House because they would not negotiate with us. And it was this carryover of this thing that ag is a problem and not part of a solution. It was a huge thing that happened in this country. And we did not recover until very recently. And I mean, we, the ag sector, we did not really start looking at ag as a beneficial part of the solution at the national level until about 2015. And I'll tell you why that changed. But all of these things that preceded it led up to this. And when the members negotiated that cap and trade in the House, they deliberately left out the agricultural sector. And it was to their detriment, because then the bill, of course, never passed in the Senate. Anyway, huge issue that we have to deal with agriculture, right? In 2009, the other thing that happened is the Framework Convention negotiations in Copenhagen were a big bust. But there was one really interesting thing that came out of there is the Brazilians negotiated something, and they said, we're going to focus on agriculture and solutions from agriculture, mostly regenerative solutions, focusing on soil carbon, biodiversity above and below ground. And they came up with a program called the Low Carbon Ag Program. And they literally created low cost loans for the agricultural sector if they adopted regenerative agricultural practices, no-till, cover cropping, reduced tillage. All of those things are part of what the Brazilians started doing in 2009, and they brought that to the international level. This started to change the thinking, right? Because a lot of countries have viewed Brazil as not the best actor, but they had the most progressive policy that they put on the table. I started working in Brazil because of that and got just a lot of interesting work going there, some of which we're now doing here in the United States. The other country that I think started working on this issue at that time was Canada. But again, there wasn't a whole lot happening here in the United States. There were no drivers to push this in the United States. What changed that all is in 2015, under the Framework Convention, they negotiated the Paris Accord. And what happened in the Paris Accord is interesting. Is like, it was different than the Kyoto Protocol when everybody said, okay, countries take on commitments and you legally have to do it, right? But no developing countries took on commitments. It was a bust because of that. Under the Paris Accord, all countries say what they can do voluntarily, and all of the countries who basically came to the table not only said what they can do voluntarily, but viewed agriculture and forestry as beneficial solutions to what they can do. Also, globally, scientists agreed we no longer have the luxury of picking and choosing what we do to combat climate change, but we have to do everything, including what we can do with biological sinks, improved soil carbon, improved forestry, right? So at the international scale in 2015, this was a huge change, right? I pointed to that kind of moratorium on sinks for a while. They were bad. Nobody was doing it. Nobody was focusing on it, except the Italians, maybe California. So this changed everything. And it's, again, agriculture started being viewed as a positive part of the solution. I started working on ESMC in 2017, and I'll come back to that. But it was with all of that backdrop that, we started thinking about, is there a way to pay farmers and ranchers for regenerative ag systems, knowing that we have these drivers, this beneficial change, if you will, towards agriculture. I'd say the other thing that has happened is that since 2020, carbon markets, which were moribund in 2018, they were starting to tank, prices were going down, there were not a lot of agricultural projects, there wasn't a big focus. Since 2020, it's been the opposite. And the reason is corporations have started to say, we are taking on greenhouse gas inventories of our own. So under the Framework Convention, one of the things I should have said is under the Framework Convention, what countries do is they look at their greenhouse gas inventories and how they reduce that or increase it through agricultural soil sinks, for instance, right? What has started happening and what really changed in 2020 is now companies are doing that. Corporations are looking at their greenhouse gas inventories and how to reduce their impacts. They're doing it the same way countries are doing it. So what we had happening at the international level with governments is now happening at the international level with corporations. And again, I will mention Jason Clay's TED Talk. That is one of the things that led to that. He was basically saying, we're focusing on what governments are doing. We're not focusing on what companies are doing that has an impact. And so now corporations are taking on commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas inventories. I'll focus on the work of food and beverage sector, because within the food and beverage sector, often 90% or more of food and beverage sector corporations have their footprint, their greenhouse gas footprint comes from agriculture. So when they take on commitments to reduce their footprints, they take on commitments to reduce the footprints in agriculture. That gives us a huge demand side opportunity to focus on regenerative ag, and that has been happening. And it started with carbon, but it's now moving to water, water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, the whole suite of, I think, beneficial outcomes from agriculture that regenerative ag brings to the table. So the picture is now coming back together in a beneficial way in which governments recognize this is all good and we need to start paying for it. And corporations are recognizing this is all good, we need to start paying for it. So all of this finally came together. I'll then turn to these graphs, and I'll send you this PowerPoint. I don't need to spend a lot of time on them. When I was working at CAG, this, I think, PowerPoint I created in 2016, believe it or not, I was thinking, and I've always used market drivers as a way to like get at these issues, because I think we have to pay for this. We have to pay farmers and ranchers for these things, and markets are a way to do that. I started thinking about, so how do we use market drivers to do this? And what is the difference between like USDA conservation programs you see here, and then supply chains? This is where the companies, the food and beverage companies, who are starting to look at how they certify reducing their footprint. And this spectrum here that I created was really, how do we create markets that can help us across all of these systems? And what is the difference in them? So I was thinking about it from the technical perspective. And this is all interesting because what we're seeing happening right now with companies and these real huge demands and the inability to get them is they're finally realizing they have to pay for it. It's all happening in a market context. Governments too are realizing we have to pay for it. Some of what governments are doing is a market context. Some is through conservation programs. So this slide really, I was thinking at the time, how do we begin to capture ways to fund things like regenerative ag, even though we called it something different in 2016? And what are the mechanisms? So this started to lay it out. And these are the things that we're still grappling with today, is some of these discrepancies. Here I put, like, for each of them, one of the interesting things is like, who are the stakeholders at risk if we don't succeed? Because this gets to who should be paying for it, right? So if we're thinking about conservation programs, they're important to the country, they're important to society, they're important to everyone. If they don't succeed, the public agencies are most at risk, federal agencies, but also, just us as society. If supply chain certification doesn't work, or we can't deliver everything those corporations need, C-suite, right? Those companies, their lines are on the hook. So this was really just the layout of how I was thinking about the drivers. Again, I won't go through it, I'll leave it with you. Here's where I'll get. So now I'll get to ESMC. We're the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, because it tells the story, I think, of not only what we're doing in this space, but what is happening in this space. So we're a nonprofit organization, and we were really created to scale beneficial outcomes from ag, with a lens towards how do we pay farmers and ranchers to do that in a market context. We're interested only in scaling those outcomes, and we think that one of the ways to do that is to pay farmers and ranchers, and to do that in a market context. We started by thinking about soil health systems, right, which I think is the very basis of regenerative ag, but we've moved above and beyond that. But this is still our mission, to advance ecosystem service markets that incentivize, in other words, pay farmers and ranchers to improve soil health systems that benefit society. And we think we can do this, and we've created this market because of all those demand signals that I told you about that now exist. The thing I'll point out here is this is a timeline of when we were formed, going back to 2017, and everything we've been doing. We designed our market in 2018. We formed this public-private partnership, and I'll show you who's part of that partnership in a minute. And the idea there was, if you think of that spectrum I showed you, the idea was to get together stakeholders across the agricultural value chain and supply chain to say, what are your needs? Whether you're a supplier, being producers and producer groups, like what do you need to engage in these programs so that you can be paid? Or what are your needs if you're a buyer, right? The demand side. Tell us what you need, we can create it. We'll bring the producers to the table, generate what you need, and pay the farmers and ranchers for that. So since 2019, we've been doing that. I circled this in red because at this time, this is when we started to see for the first time corporations expressing a willingness to pay for this. Prior to 2019, they were saying to producers, you do this or we won't buy from you. You reduce your greenhouse gas footprint, improve your water quality, or we won't buy from you. They figured out over the course of about 3 years, it wouldn't work that way because we have to give the tools and the technologies to producers to do this if we want them to do this, as well as grow food, feed, fuel, fiber, right? So this is what we're doing now, is building out those tools so that, again, corporates get what they need, governments get what they need, but producers have the tools and technologies basically to participate. This slide shows who our members are. And the important point here is, like, our members come across the agriculture supply chain and value chain. They represent corporates who are our buyers. They represent agricultural sector groups like corn growers, almond growers, Cattlemen's Beef, National Farmers Union, and then environmental groups, researchers, land grant universities. And what we've been doing is like building the market and testing it. So we have, I don't know, probably close to 20 pilot projects across the country where we're testing our protocols, testing the system, testing the trading and the payments, if you will, for these things all together. And this is something that had not happened in the past. Largely, these markets were built in the past without the ag sector at the table. And so they often didn't meet the needs of all the players. Our hope is that by doing this with everyone at the table, we can actually scale beneficial outcomes. I don't necessarily have to go through all of this, but our role in this, and I think it speaks to what you see happening on the horizon with all these new carbon programs popping up, is what we're really trying to do is create the opportunities, invest in the infrastructure so that if a producer chooses to participate anywhere in the country, their experience is the same, it looks the same to them. We're trying to create, if you will, easy buttons for everyone. So we take on the work of working on protocols with standard setting bodies that incorporate the practices that you can get paid for and that these buyers will actually pay for. And right now they include things like no-till, the use of cover crops, multiple cropping systems, crop diversity. We're seeing a lot more perennials and other crops like that enter the landscape. We're seeing increased interest in things like biodiversity that allows us right now to look at biodiversity above ground, but ultimately I think will lead us to look at below ground biodiversity as well. In our market program, what we do is when we enroll a producer, we work with buyers and figure out what are their needs, and then we generate the credits for it. We can generate all of these credits simultaneously. Right now, in every one of our projects, carbon and greenhouse gases are always a desire of the corporates. Water quality, almost always a desire. Sometimes the corporate, sometimes some other buyer. Water quantity or water use conservation, largely in the 16 Western states, and I think where you probably are in the arid West, water quantity and water use conservation is a huge issue of issue of interest right now. And then increasingly, of course, biodiversity. And biodiversity, I will flag again, going back to Jason Clay's TED Talk, he called out, and I pointed out, he was saying the greatest impact on biodiversity globally and biodiverse hotspots was agriculture. And we're only now starting to even think about giving credits to the agricultural sector for beneficial impacts on biodiversity. So again, it's all coming together, if you will, in a nice package. This market design, you'll notice that that spectrum I showed you before, we have created our market so that we can participate in two different markets. One is scope 3 at the bottom there. That is where corporates have taken on these commitments, and they have rules for how to account and how to meet those commitments. And so most of the work we do right now is with those corporations, trying to help them be successful. Most of them are spending millions of dollars on regenerative ag systems and things that they hope will make them successful. We want to ensure that they're successful, right? Because if they're successful, that means they can pay farmers and ranchers for these systems. That means we have additional private sector money coming in to fund these practices that we are also trying to link with what the public sector and the federal government and states are doing, right? So that we can leverage those funds and all be working together. There's some work we're doing in the carbon offset space and in compliance grade water quality, but we find that with corporates, the biggest demand and where there's more investment available right now for ag is on those supply chain reporting. So that's 90% of more of the work that we're doing. This slide just shows where we're operating right now. You'll see that we're not operating in the Western Range, but we are, with funding from the Walton Family Foundation, doing a market analysis of how we can operate in this region here and what the most important drivers are, both from the corporate side as well as the on the ground producer side. There's like probably more diversity of cropping systems there than anywhere else, I think, except in California. So that's really interesting to me. California has about 400 commodities. I don't know the number there in that Western Range, but clearly there's more that we can do here. We are operating like, you know, just on the corners here, if you will, of Colorado already, looking to really move into the Western Range there. So that is everything that I had. I'm happy to like have a discussion about any of this. I didn't necessarily cover all of the details of everything, but I hope that what I showed is a story about how we got here and what the real drivers are. And I think those drivers are important because for me, it's a source of funding and finance for everything that needs to happen on these landscapes.
Thank you, Debbie. That was so great to hear. I think that like it's so interesting to see the progress that we've made and that it always takes so long on the international level to finally get somewhere like this. So it's exciting that we're finally here now and there's like so much potential. So that's really exciting. I think so. I would love to open up the floor for people. If anybody has questions, feel free to put like a little asterisk in the chat and I can unmute you. That might be a little less chaotic than everybody trying to jump in at once. Yeah, let's see if anybody have any questions you want to ask or discussion topics if you're curious about anything.
I do. Thank you, Debbie. That was a great presentation. It's good to learn about your organization. I'm actually joining you from Montana, and we have a group here who's trying to come up with some ideas how to do to get local food grown here. I mean, here I am in the middle of an agricultural district, and it's hard to get local food, although we would like to do organic too, but we have groups of farmers that come to the farmers market, and they are, the primary providers are Hutterite colony or Hutterite colonies that I've talked to them a little bit about doing organic, and they're really not interested in it. But I was wondering, how could I get information on your organization to them? And I mean, you're addressing a much wider interest and problem than I am as far as growing local and organic. But, you know, I think it would be great information for them to know how to do the carbon sequestration too.
Yeah. So I can send some like 1 or 2 pagers about ESMC along with this PowerPoint to Julia and Jordan. The other thing I think is that so we incorporate organic into our program, and we're seeing more and more our companies like diversifying their portfolio and going more into organic. So I think you'll start to see more demand side signals. I don't really know what's happening like with the National Organics Program at the national level. I know for a long time there was a lot more money going into that. I can share materials with you, right, on what we're doing, and know that we do include organics in our program. But I don't have anything specific to that might be helpful from that particular perspective.
Okay, well, I'd appreciate any information, and I'll present it to our group that's working on this problem. We figure it's going to take us a while to get organized and get something going, but we already have the growers here, so it's like trying to convert them and to show that it is a profitable thing to do. But
yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And I will say one of the things that I think that's happening in the corporate supply chain, they have to account for when they purchase a product, how far it's transported. They have to account for the greenhouse gas footprint of transportation to wherever they sell it, wherever they buy it, and wherever they sell it. That is having implications for what they do. And they're starting to realize that one way to reduce their footprint is to do more local buying and selling, right? I think you're going to see a lot more of that in the future, now that they have to account for that and think about it. So we have more and more companies asking us, not only tell us how we reduce the footprint of agriculture, how can we reduce the footprint of transport, of distribution? And literally I've had 3 conversations with companies about that this week. So I think the good news is that the demand side signals we're seeing, I think, are going to start to have impact at the local level. It still might be a couple of years, but I think you will see that ultimately.
Great, thank you. And I will watch that TED Talk, but I was very encouraged and excited to hear about corporations taking a part in this. And, from the sake of investment, like investing in 401ks, I would rather invest in companies that are doing things like that. Do you just have off the top of your head some names of corporations that are interested in that?
I can send you some reports that actually lay out what they're doing. And there are some recent reports with report cards, right? And the way this all started happening was pressure campaigns, right? And now they're all starting to realize that their consumers want it, their shareholders want it, their stakeholders want it. So they're doing it because they have to. But some of them are literally spending millions. But yeah, I can send you some links to reports with scorecards about what the companies are doing. And a lot of them really are doing a lot and really trying hard because their future depends on it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for asking that questions. Anybody else have anything they want to bring up?
Yes, I have a question. So I'm writing an article on innovative clean energy technologies, and I'm curious what you believe the future of clean energy technologies would entail, and how do you think that relates to regenerative agriculture and your knowledge of the field? I also have another subsequent question after that, but I'm going to try to take it one step at a time.
Yeah, I'll close on the answer with, I don't work in energy. Okay. I do really just work on the ag side and ag production side. I will say, however, bioenergy, right, from agriculture production is something that I think has a bright future. I think there's a lot of controversy surrounding it because of the way you have to account for the footprint. But I still think there's a lot of promise there when you don't get into the food versus fuel fight, right? Which often comes up, particularly at a global level. Right now, like the aviation industry has huge demand for like renewable fuels because they too have to reduce their footprint. And they are actually under a mandate. They're the only sector in the world that has a global mandate at the sector level to reduce their footprint. That may also happen in the future to other sectors. But one of the ways to do that is through sustainable aviation fuel. Someone told me this week that soy-based fuels don't qualify, whereas ethanol and corn-based fuels do. Again, I don't follow that. I think there's some opportunities there as long as we do address the food versus fuel issue and land use change impacts. Other than that, I'm afraid I'm not going to be the best person to answer your questions about the clean tech or energy.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious because there's a lot of talk going around, and I live here in Colorado. The mayor in Pueblo is planning to put up a nuclear energy plant, and there's a lot of controversy around that, knowing that it is a wise decision for the economy, and it's a great way to sustain energy efficiently. But there also are significant downsides, and I'm curious if maybe you would have any insight into how your knowledge of regenerative agriculture could possibly solve those problems. But if you believe that you don't have a significant answer, that's okay.
No, I have enough to be dangerous in terms of knowledge there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then I was also curious. You talked a lot about how your organization is utilizing the potential of markets to also benefit humanity. How do you think the economy could be utilized more effectively to actually benefit innovation in these more progressive policies you're speaking of?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think the biggest thing we could do is actually treat environmental and human health externalities as internalities, right? What economists call externalities. We haven't accounted for traditionally the impacts of what we do on natural resources, on like air, water, right? The environment. And until we do, we're going to continue to degrade those resources, including agricultural resources. Everything we're doing right now is an attempt to put a signal on that and internalize those externalities. That Jason Clay TED Talk that has led to these sustainable supply chain obligations and footprinting exercises are having the impact of doing it, but it's coming from the private sector, not from governments. Governments have to do the same, right? We all have to put a price and a price signal on the environmental and human health impacts that to date we haven't done. They're not externalities, despite, it kind of almost infuriates me when economists say that. They are not externalities. And we are here today because we've always treated them as externalities.
I agree. I think that's a common misunderstanding with economics, is believing that profit is, I think, necessary for a functioning economy to function. I really only think that's the veil of the deeper system at play. So it's starting to change. It's trying to see where that new paradigm, what that new paradigm would look like, and see if humanity could shift its focus and understanding, and maybe create some disillusionment in the field. So I appreciate that.
An interesting place where it's starting to come together is the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030, right? Those sustainable development goals actually look at everything from human to environmental impacts, development, et cetera, under this holistic frame where you do account for that. Until, again, we start doing everything with that frame and start quantifying those impacts across all 17 of those indicators, we'll continue with the degradation mindset.
Great. Well, thank you.
Looks like Allison was trying to ask a question real quick. Allison, do you still have a question?
Well, yeah. Debbie, I've been, I'm actually a volcanologist, a USGS fellow, but I've been working in the natural terrestrial carbon sequestration realm since moving to Colorado in 2000. And it's nice to put the face to the name. It's an honor. My question follows a little bit on Trenton's. I am a delegate to the COP, and my area is loss and damage. And your point, the private sector, the government sector, if you have a thought on that, you can send it to me, or you can comment for everybody now. And then the two related, sort of related points is I have started to work with homes in the mid-American agricultural sector. They need renewable energy. They need credit for storage. They need that. What's the update on that? Because it's really critical to their future. We can make sure the pipe fitters could continue to have good jobs. What about our ag people, right? And then the very last piece is what the Nature Conservancy is doing. I've done a lot of work with the help of everybody up at CSU and also a number of your groups, documenting the carbon sequestration potential of our forests. And this thing that we're just gonna make pellets for coal-fired power plants. I mean, oh my God. So that's three big things. If you can comment on any of them, but mostly if you have a message for loss and damage. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll tell you on like the pellets and particularly what's been happening. Oh God, it's got to be 20 years now, right? The Southeast paper industry shipping those pellets to Europe, right? That is a perverse policy from the EU, which supposedly has a better, environmental policy than us, that needs to change. And we've known it since it started. I'm not even sure how to address that one, Allison. I would just say it's perverse.
Think about it. Think about it.
It's just an example of how, like, I don't know why. So the Europeans, I told you about the negotiations in The Hague fell apart because the German NGOs, which are very powerful, like European NGOs are very powerful, right? Which is why that whole COP failed. Why they haven't focused on that issue is a question to me. And like, someone needs to talk to WWF Germany about why they haven't like stomped all over that policy in the EU, because they seem to have a lot of power elsewhere.
Okay.
And that's who I would talk to, is the European NGOs. They're very powerful.
Okay.
On the renewable energy question, how do we pay farmers and ranchers for that? That too, I think, is a policy issue, right?
Right.
Because the consternation right now is that food and fuel debate and how we account for that. The problem we all have is we are not thinking about land use and land use change. We don't have national policies on land use and land use change. And we know that we're losing agricultural land at an unsustainable rate. Most of it is being lost to development. We're not debating that, right? We're debating whether or not we should grow like crops for food or fuels. We're having the wrong debate. And so that is something I would advocate for. Let's talk about our land use and policies for land use. California, 10 years into their cap and trade program, figured out they were never going to solve their climate change problem because their greenhouse gas inventory was going up. And you know why? Because of the loss of agricultural lands. They weren't accounting for it. And all that land is lost. They lose all the carbon and they lose it to development. So not only are they losing the carbon, but their emissions are going up. Transportation, buildings, energy, right? So they figured out very, very late in the game too. They hadn't thought about ag. They hadn't thought about land use, right? We need to start doing the same thing at the national level. And at least be thinking about how we're using land. And if we're losing agricultural land, what is it being used for? It's a long way of maybe not quite answering your question.
You got me thinking of a bunch of more questions I'm going to write you on.
Okay. And I would apply that also to the loss and damages thing, not only the externality issues, but land is a resource, natural resources are resources we can't replenish, right?
I'm trying to get that into the loss and damage conversation, but they want to put it into accepted political boxes.
Yeah, that's the
like,
problem.
I'm going crazy.
The politics screw us every single time. I would say this, the one thing we haven't really accounted for is how we protect existing soil, carbon, other stocks. We're all focused on protecting forests. We're not focused on protecting existing soil carbon stocks. You can't pay for that in a market. The federal government can, and the federal government should be thinking about it, because every ton of carbon we lose from existing carbon stocks is more expensive and much harder to put back. So we need, this will come back to the land use policy eventually, but let's just talk about protecting existing soil carbon stocks, not just the forest.
Great. Thank you, Allison, for that question. That was a great one. I think that Jan had put an asterisk in the chat. Jan, do you still have your question? We've got about 10 minutes left. Gaia, we're gonna try to get to you after Jan if we've got time. But if not, people just please make sure you've got your email down to me here if you don't have your email on our list already, and we can make sure to connect you if you've got extra questions or anything you want to get involved with. So just let me know. But Jan, go right ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Debbie, for this presentation. I was on a call this morning with a Colorado state senator on a bill we're planning to run to put together some regenerative agriculture pilot programs in the state of Colorado with a focus on our dryland farmers and whether we can implement cover crops to do some soil moisture retention in areas where dryland farming is 100% dependent on rainfall. We're looking at water conservation efforts down in the San Luis Valley because the Ogallala Aquifer is in increasingly scary shape. And I'm sure you know about the water crisis from the Colorado River and Lake Mead and Powell and so on.
Yeah.
And you frankly can't address agriculture without addressing water. So we're looking at that. We're looking at an agrovoltaics pilot project because in our super hot, dry areas, there are opportunities for solar farm installations that can grow crops underneath. And potentially retain more moisture, need less water, et cetera, et cetera. So I noticed that you are on the eastern plains of Colorado as developing a market, and that's certainly where our dryland farmers are, but the San Luis Valley is in kind of south central. So I can see the service that you provide being really beneficial for this legislation. And I wondered if that's something you are interested in getting involved in.
Yeah, so our policy director does policy work at the state level, and I can definitely connect you to him. We've had a lot of interest out of Colorado, I will say, right, for obvious reasons. And I think there's a lot of opportunities out of Colorado. And Walton Family Foundation is very interested in the Colorado River Basin, right? Both the upper and the lower, and there are different opportunity sets there. So that's part of our market assessment, but yeah, would love to be connected on what you're doing there because I personally think while we don't do a huge amount of work at the state level, that is where things are going to continue to percolate and be really innovative is at the state level. I do a lot of work with Cindy Laird at the Colorado Department of Ag. She's got a lot, like that woman has a lot of energy and puts a lot into it. So I'm just really impressed by what's going on there. And I'm looking forward to us having a presence there.
That'd be great because, we have some money to spend and we created an agricultural soil health department last year.
Okay.
And we're also planning we have a $2.5 million grant to take our forest fire down deadfall and our beetle kill timber, pyrolyze it into biochar and provide it to our agricultural community. So between all of these areas, we're really looking at setting up some pilots that can help provide us with feedback in combination with CSU's agricultural department, which is one of the best in the country, if not the world, to see which mechanisms provide the most carbon sinks and improve the nutritional and GDP of the farmer, revenue source of the farmer, using a number of different carbon farming ways, if you will. So I'd love to talk to your policy director.
All right, great. Thanks. And thanks for your work, Jen.
Thanks, Jan. Gaia, is your question quick? We could probably fit it in just a couple minutes. Otherwise, we can do it after.
I think it's quick. Thank you, Debbie. I was just curious about the motivations for the corporations being engaged in supporting regenerative ag. If you could
Yeah.
say a little more about that.
I can tell you from my perspective what I have observed, and it's sometimes nebulous, right? But it has picked up so much. It started off with like pressure campaigns from NGOs, and Jason Clay, like I give a lot of credit to Jason. His thinking is what got a lot of people thinking about how we could create impact. Stakeholders, producers, or consumers, largely young consumers, like have been showing such an interest and really putting a lot of pressure to find out how is that food you sell to me produced? Who grows it? How do they grow it, right? That started. But the other thing is that a lot of these corporations are multinational, and they started seeing that they couldn't source the products they've been sourcing historically from a lot of countries because of impacts of climate change, right? And so for them, it was a financial risk as well as increasingly stakeholder, shareholder, consumer risk, right? And then what with the advent of like the Science-Based Targets Initiative and these standards for how companies assess their greenhouse gas portfolios and then reduce them, it's just caught on, and it's like wildfire now. And so like all of these companies are trying to outdo each other doing it. So I would say it's not any one thing, it's a lot of things coming together. And I think ultimately all of us realizing what we're doing is not sustainable.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Gaia. Thank you so much, Debbie. This was amazing. I think everybody would say this was very informative and a great discussion to have. And I'm going to take everybody's emails down, make sure that we get you all on our email list, and we can, Debbie, if you just want to email us with the rest of the information and the documents that you wanted to share,
Yeah.
and we'll get that out to everybody. Any last words, Josie, before we head off?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming out. I really enjoyed hearing what everyone had to say. And yeah, I think this was a great discussion. It was very engaging and informative. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Keep up your work.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.